Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to explain how to create your occupations roster. So this video is relevant when you get to step 2, create your occupations roster in the process. So this is what the page looks like. And once you have obtained your Holland interest codes, then you can start step 2, which is creating your occupations roster. So the first thing is you need those occupation codes, and what that means is that you open up whatever your list of codes is. So for me, if I was going through the process, my 3 codes would be S, SI, and SA. Those are my 3 codes. Social by itself, social and investigative, and social and artistic. So I've got my codes, and so I'm ready to move on to the next step. So the first thing I do is open up an ONA interest search page in a separate browser tab. So if I click on this button here, it will do that, and so it asks me if I have an interest code, and so I'm going to plug in my first one. My first one is S by itself, right? So I'm going to use the first drop down box here and select S for social. I'm going to leave the second and the third boxes blank. Then I'm going to click go so that it will search for occupations that match this code of just S by itself. So I click go. Now it will display a list of occupations that match this code, which is social by itself. The first thing you're going to want to do is look down here, and if it has an underlined more occupations statement here hyperlinked, click on that, because we want to be able to see all the occupations. So in this case there's 144 to look at, whereas by default it only shows us 85. But we want to be able to see them all. So I click on that so that it will display them all. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that it has the list of occupations with one web page for each, and you can click on any. You can see that I've already clicked on food servers and hosts and hostesses before, so it turned the hyperlink purple. You can notice that these occupations are ordered by job zone, and you can even select down so that it will only display jobs in a certain job zone, but I just like to leave it on all personally. Now, job zone is a way of classifying how much education and training is needed to go into a given population, or excuse me, a given occupation. So they're ordered by job zone, with those occupations requiring the least preparation shown up at top, and those needing the most preparation shown down at the bottom with 5s. I'll briefly explain each. Job zone 1 means very little prep needed. Job zone 2 means generally you need a high school degree or a GED or an equivalent to do that job, but not necessarily always. Job zone 3 typically requires a 2-year associate's degree or community college degree or a training or certificate of some kind. But not always. 4 means you typically need a 4-year college degree, like a bachelor's of science or a bachelor's of arts degree. And then 5 means you need some sort of advanced degree, like a PhD, an MD, a law degree, so some sort of doctoral or master's or professional degree to do this sort of work. So for some of you are only seriously thinking about occupations in lower job zones or higher job zones, and some of you are flexible. At this point in the process, I encourage you not to ignore occupations just because they happen to be in a certain job zone. If you are going through the systematic career exploration process, we'll get to think a lot more about job zone, about level of education and training needed later in the process. We don't have to worry about that right now, though. So don't discriminate against occupations just because of what job zone they're in. So what you're going to want to do is you want to have your blank occupations roster out. In this case, I'm just going to use an Excel file, though you could use a Word document if you wish. I like Excel files because I like being able to work with the table format. And so I'm going to be writing in the names of occupations into these cells here, into this list that I've started down here. Okay, so you need to have that sheet of paper or Microsoft Excel file or Microsoft Word file or a Google Sheet or a Google document, whatever it is that works well for you. And so here's what you do. You start at the top of the list and we work our way down. And so the first occupation is counter attendants, cafeteria, food concessions, and coffee shop. So if I didn't know a lot about this occupation, if I wasn't familiar with what tasks people working in this occupation do on a daily basis, then I would click on the name of this occupation to review the summary page for that occupation. So let's do that. So I click on it, and then it displays the summary report. It's got a lot of different sections you can see here. So you can see there's all these different sections, but for right now, at this point in the process, don't read all this stuff. You don't have time, and it'll just overwhelm you. I encourage you to just read this part up here. So read the brief description at the top. Some of the sample reported job titles can be helpful to see what kind of names people who do this occupation are called, the job titles. And the important place, the most important place, is this tasks section. So again, it says 5 of 17 displayed. We want to click on this plus button there to display them all. We want to be able to see them all. So what you do when you're looking at a given summary report for an occupation, you want to learn about some of the tasks that people in this occupation do. So read through these tasks here. And as you're reading through these tasks, you want to think about if doing these sorts of tasks might be interesting to you, if doing these tasks for a part of your day-to-day job as a part of your future career, if this is stuff that's interesting to you or not. And if what you read is interesting to you and you're like, yeah, I would enjoy doing that, that could be a good fit, then you would add the name of this occupation to your occupations roster. So in this case, I might select and copy the name of this. If I liked it, pull up my occupations roster and paste it in. Let's paste it in doing that option. It's a little cleaner. There we go. Okay, so I pasted in counter attendants, cafeteria, food concessions, and coffee shop as my first occupation that might fit. Okay, so we back out and we go back, and then we keep going down the list. And remember, if you don't recognize a given occupation, you don't know what it's about, or you're not really familiar with what tasks people working in that occupation do on a daily basis, then go ahead and click on that occupation and learn more about it. People can get into trouble because they can see something like child care workers or firefighters, and they're like, oh, you know, I've seen them on TV. I think I know what they do. But the thing is, what we might hear about here and there in our classes, or that we might see on the television or read about on the internet, a lot of times is only a very small piece of the truth. And sometimes the information is actually inaccurate that we're exposed to out in the world. So it's very helpful to double check and make sure you actually understand what the occupation is about by clicking on the occupation and learning more about it. Because you may find that some of the tasks involved with that occupation are actually different than what you expected. And you can trust this summary report from Own It Online because it's one of the most well-researched and carefully collected sources of information on occupations that's maintained by professionals who are employed by the United States government. So they put a lot of time and effort, and they survey people who are actually doing this occupation out in the world. They survey them to find out what it's actually like, and that's where this information comes from. So it's very high quality information that you should trust and use as a first source. So reading about these tasks, so if I was looking at forest firefighters, learning about them, then I'd ask myself, is this something that appeals to me? It sounds like these tasks are interesting to me or not. And let's say, it's not that interesting to me. So maybe I will not add forest fighters to my list. So I will not be adding it to my occupations roster in this case. So we're gonna move past that. So you're going one by one through the occupations, learning about the ones that you're not sure about or that you're interested to learn more about. And we do this all the way down the list until we get to the end. Okay. And then once we've gotten to the end, then we go to our next code. So I look through all of the occupations in this list that match my first code of just S, right? So now we go to what's my second code. My second code is SI, social investigative. So we've already got S in the first slot. Then we put in investigative in the second slot, and we leave the third box blank. We always do when we're using my system. Okay, so SI. Click go. Then it'll produce a list of occupations. You'll notice that some of them, like dietetic technician, some of them that appeared in a list before will also appear in this one, and if that's the case, then you can just ignore them. You already looked at them. But there will also be a number of new occupations in the new list that you didn't see on the last one because it's a different combination of Holland types. Okay, and so we repeat the process. We go through the list one by one, and when we need to learn more about an occupation, we click on it, open up the tasks, and read about the type of things that they do. And if we like what we see and we're saying, yeah, this occupation could be interesting to me, so maybe I really liked this stuff, and I'm like, okay, hearing aid specialists. I'm going to add that to my occupations roster. And pasting in like that. So hearing aid specialists, my second occupation on my occupations roster. Okay, so we back out, and so we go through this, right? Same as before. Go through the list of occupations. Then once we're down at the bottom, if we looked through them all and learned what we wanted to learn, then we've completed my second code. Okay, moving on. What's my third code? It's SA. All right, so I go back here. S is already plugged in here, and then I need to make the second one A, and then I click go. And so it produces another list of occupations. Some of them appeared on prior lists, most of them are new. And so we go through like we did before. And then once we've gotten down here, then we're done. We've looked through all the occupations that matched our different Holland interest codes, right? And again, let me stress that when you're reading up on a given occupation, you only need to look at this initial paragraph and then read about the tasks. Okay, there's a lot of other information down here later in the profile, but don't worry about that stuff for now. We're going to be considering that later in the process. Okay, so we'll get to that later, but don't overwhelm yourself by reading those other sections and learning all about them. Okay, now your goal by the end of this process and looking through these lists is you're ideally trying to create an occupations roster that has about 10 to 25 occupations listed in it. So right now I have 2 so far, right? But ideally, by the time you're done looking through your final Holland interest code, you will have added at least 10 to 25 occupations to your roster. So these are 10 to 25 occupations that you think could potentially be a good fit for your career interests. And so that's what we mean by building your occupations roster. It's a list of possible occupations that could fit you well. And the great thing about creating a single roster like this is that in step 3 of the process, you'll be able to start narrowing down this roster of potential occupations by crossing off the ones that are not as good of a fit for your interests, for your skills and abilities, for your values, etc. We'll talk more about those criteria later, but that's what happens in step 3. There's a few points I really want to emphasize when it comes to building this occupations roster. The first point is to take your time. You don't want to rush this part of the process. When you carefully review the occupations that match each of your codes, you maximize the chances of discovering occupations that could be a great fit for you. But when you rush, you might miss important occupations that could be a good fit. So it's worth taking your time and doing this part right. Because if you build a strong roster, then you can start to narrow that roster with confidence. I should also mention that it can be annoying, anxiety-provoking, or tiring to have to carefully review these occupations. And again, remember that being systematic with your career exploration is well worth your time. It could save you a lot of money, a lot of years, a lot of term papers, a lot of stress and hassle by choosing an occupation through this systematic process that's a really good fit, one where you don't have to say, oops, I was wrong, I went in a direction that wasn't as good of a fit, and then you need to backtrack and maybe lose some money and some time. Again, it's never a perfect process, but by being systematic, you can maximize your chances of having identified occupations that could be a really good fit for you. So find ways to manage those anxious or anger feelings that you might experience as you're doing this process, so that you can continue to do this well and have it work out. And if by the end of this process you have fewer than 10 occupations on your roster, that could mean a few different things. On one hand, the criteria, the rules you're using for deciding what occupations get to be included on your list or not, those rules might be too strict. You might be too tough. Remember, the purpose of this roster is to create a rough draft list of potential occupations, and we want to include any occupations that have a reasonable chance of being interesting to you. So if you have fewer than 10 occupations, you may want to go back through those lists of occupations that match your Holland interest codes and be a little less hard, be a little less stringent, be a little less picky, and kind of open your mind up more to occupations that might be potentially interesting, because you ideally want to get at least 10 on your occupation. So think more broadly. However, it's also possible that if you have less than 10 occupations, that it may be true that you might have very narrow and defined interests, and maybe there genuinely are only a very few number of occupations that could be a good fit. That is possible. So some people do genuinely have less than 10 occupations, but as much as you can, try and get at least 10 down on your roster. And it's also possible too that sometimes people don't put very many occupations down on their occupations roster because their Holland interest codes that they created actually are not the best codes for them. Maybe because they didn't have the opportunity to work with a career exploration specialist who was able to help them make sure that their classifications of their 6 types were accurate. It's possible that maybe you didn't get accurate classifications, and that's why it's not turning out good codes that you can use to accurately find occupations that match. So it might be possible that you want to go back and reconsider your classifications of the 6 types so that it can lead to different codes that may actually better capture your career interests. Because if you put in different codes into ONET, then you will create different lists of occupations to consider. Now, on the other hand, for some of you, your roster may be more than 25 occupations. You may be on the high end where you are just throwing in a lot of occupations onto your roster. And if that's the case, then the criteria, the rules that you used to decide what occupations to add to your list might have been too broad or too loose. In that case, you might want to be more stringent. You might want to go back through your list and be stricter about what gets on the roster. You can ask yourself, okay, for this first occupation that I added on my occupations roster, does this occupation actually have a decent chance of being a top occupation for me, being one of the better fits, or is it only kind of interesting and that's why I included it? So if you have more than 25, you can go ahead and eliminate those that are some of the less interesting ones in that list. Okay, so a lot of times we can say like, ooh, these are the really interesting ones, and these are the kind of interesting ones. So if you have more than 25 occupations, go ahead and remove or cross out or delete those occupations that are less interesting to you, okay? Because you want to try and get it under 25 occupations so that it's a little bit more manageable for you. Okay, so at this point we've gone through all my instructions and advice on the step 2 create your occupations roster page. So we're all the way down here, and so once you've gone through all your codes and created an occupations roster with between 10 and 25 occupations, then you're ready to finalize your roster. And now we click on the Finalize Your Roster page, which is at this point in the SCEA process. And so here's what we got to talk about next. So far we have used ONET to search for occupations that match your Holland interest codes, which is great. But there are other ways to search for occupations on ONET Online, such as through the Find Occupations page. Okay. So if we click on it, you can see this is the Find Occupations page, onetonline.org/find. And so you can see a bunch of different drop-down boxes that you can use to search for different things. You can search for occupations within certain career clusters, industries, STEM, science, tech, engineering, and math fields, stuff like that. There's a lot of different ways to search. I have a few favorites. I think career clusters, industries, and job families are some of the more helpful ways to search, and potentially the STEM drop-down, the STEM discipline drop-down, if it's interesting to you. So if we go over here, here's the career clusters. And I've got to say that career clusters, industry, and job family have some similar categories. So if you've already gone through the career clusters and then you're moving on to industry and it's feeling a little repetitive, it might be a sign that you can just stop at that point. But I do generally recommend at least starting with the career clusters and check out these different career clusters. So you can see they're in different sort of categories here, like agriculture, food, and natural resource related occupations, education and training, information tech, stuff like that. So you can click on, let's say, education and training and click go, and it will produce a list of occupations that fall into this education and training career cluster. And not only that, it also organizes it by a career pathway, which is kind of one smaller piece of a career cluster. So within a single cluster, like education and training, there's a bunch of different career pathways. So administration and administrative support is one, professional support services is another, teaching training is another. So yeah, there are 3 total pathways under this education and training career cluster. And so you can see occupations that match a given pathway within a given career cluster. So you want to select from the drop-down those career clusters that are most interesting to you, that most align. And so you may already see some things like, hey, I remember I added architecture teachers to my occupations roster. Let's look at some of the other teaching and training occupations that fall on this list, because maybe there's some similar ones that I missed before. So this is a nice way to double check using something other than Holland interest types, what sort of occupations might be interesting. So usually people, by going through the career clusters, looking by different industries, looking at different job families, they can find additional occupations that could be a good fit for them that they can add to their occupations roster. So it will help kind of finalize their roster. And so this page gives advice for using these alternative ways of searching for looking at other potential occupations to add to your occupations roster. It also gives some advice about how some of the basic interest survey, if you completed that long basic interest survey, some of those basic marker areas are well aligned with some of these career clusters and industries. And so if you scored really high in a given basic interest marker area, then you can go find it in one of these drop downs and look at the occupations that fall under that. So that can be another great way, and it's talked about more here. And then lastly, before we're done building our roster, we're asking, are there any other occupations that you at one time or another thought you might want to pursue for your career? So you can consider just generally, are there occupations that I haven't seen so far in my searching using ONET Online that might be good to add to my roster because they are genuinely a good fit for my interests? Okay, so after you've done these things, then we're finalizing your roster. I give some more advice here. And so if you can answer this question. This is the key question right here. Do I think that my roster contains almost all of the occupations that might be a good fit for my career interests, or might there still be other good fitting occupations out there that have not yet made it onto my roster yet? So if you think that your roster of 10 to 25 occupations has those occupations that are probably a good fit for you, it feels like it's not missing important other occupations, then we're ready to move on to step 3. We're ready to start narrowing that occupations roster through a process of elimination. But if you're saying no, or I'm not sure, it feels like my roster might be missing important things, then here are some prompts that you can use to help think through, okay, how can I catch those occupations that I might be missing? So that is an in-depth explanation of how to do step 2 of building your occupations roster, and then how to finalize it using that find occupations portion of Own It Online. Good luck.